Hey everyone. So lately it seems like every time you turn on the news, it's another scary story about a plane crash. And, it makes you kind of wonder, like, are planes actually crashing more often, or does it just feel like that? You know what I mean?
It's a good question, yeah. It really is because it gets at, how we perceive risk, how our perception of risk can be influenced by things other than just like cold hard data.
Right, exactly. So we're diving into a Reddit thread today where people are talking about this very thing. And there's all sorts of different opinions on this. Like some people are, uh, you know, making jokes, blaming everything from like gremlins to other groups of people.
Yeah, which is kind of wild when you think about it, but it actually shows how we are as humans. When something feels scary or out of our control, we try to like find an explanation for it.
Yeah, and sometimes those explanations aren't exactly rational.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like our brains just have to like find a pattern or someone to blame, even if it's totally random.
Right? Like it's got to be someone's fault, right?
Yeah, sure.
But then you see other people in this Reddit thread trying to like look at the data. Some people are saying there are like hundreds of plane crashes every year in the US. Some are saying over 1,000, even like 1,400. And
Wow.
then others are saying there are actually fewer
So how do we
accidents.
make sense of all that?
It's confusing, right? It's like,
Yeah.
especially because on the surface, those numbers are kind of
Oh
scary.
yeah, for sure.
And this is where it's important to understand, like, what we're actually talking about. Like, are we talking about big commercial airlines or are we talking about smaller private planes?
Right, right.
Because, like, in general aviation, which is the smaller private planes, statistically, that's way riskier than flying on a commercial airline.
Okay, so that alone could be why some people are like throwing out those really big numbers.
Exactly, exactly. It's like comparing apples and oranges, right?
Right, right.
And it's important for you to keep that in mind because, those big scary numbers might not be giving you the full picture about the actual risk of, hopping on a plane.
Okay, so it's all about context.
Yes, context is everything.
Okay.
Now, one user brought up a report from the NTSB, which is the National Transportation Safety Board here in the US, and they reported 87 aviation accidents since the beginning of the year, which is actually down from last year at this time.
So that's good news, right? Fewer accidents.
It seems like it, yeah. But there's more to it because while the total number of accidents is down, the number of people who have died in those accidents has actually gone up quite a bit.
Oh wow, so like even though there are fewer crashes, they're more deadly?
That's what the data seems to show, yeah. At least so far this year. But it's important to remember that sometimes certain events can really skew the statistics, like that really sad collision in DC recently where a military helicopter hit a commercial plane.
Yeah.
That's like a total anomaly. That's not something that happens all the time.
Right. A total tragedy, but not necessarily a pattern.
Exactly. And then there was that Delta plane that flipped in Tremonto during that crazy
Oh,
snowstorm.
yeah.
That was pretty scary. But everyone survived, which is amazing when you think about it. And it really shows how effective all the safety stuff on planes really is, even in extreme situations like that.
Yeah, it's incredible how much technology and training goes into making sure everyone on board is safe.
It really is. It really is. And this leads to another point that came up a lot in that Reddit thread, the comparison between flying and driving.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I saw a lot of people saying, like, we drive every day and don't even think twice about it, but one plane crash and everyone freaks out.
It's true. And, statistically, flying is very safe. One person in the bread even did the math and found that you're actually way more likely to die in a car crash on any given day than you are to die in a plane crash.
So our perception of risk is kind of messed up.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And a lot of people in the thread were pointing to the media and how they cover these events.
Right.
Like, we tend to hear about plane crashes more because they're dramatic and make for good headlines, not necessarily because they're happening more often.
Yeah, it's like they say, if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. And we see this with other types of events too. Like, remember how much attention train derailments got after that incident in East Palestine? Once something grabs the public's attention, the media tends to report on similar events more, even if the actual number of those events hasn't really changed.
So it just feels like it's happening more.
Exactly, exactly. And psychologists call this availability bias, our tendency to overestimate the chances of something happening if it's easy to remember or we've seen it in the news a lot.
Ah, that makes sense. Like we see all these images and stories about plane crashes, and our brains start to think it's way more common than it actually is.
Exactly. And this just shows how important it is to be aware of how the media can affect the way we see things, especially when it comes to things that make us feel scared or anxious.
Yeah, so if you're feeling nervous about your next flight, it might be helpful to just take a step back and ask yourself, is this fear based on like real evidence? Or am I just reacting to what I've been seeing and hearing?
That's a really good point. It's okay to acknowledge those feelings, but we don't have to let them control us.
Right. And actually, this Reddit thread, even with all the kind of crazy theories, actually brought up some good points about how to think about risk and make better decisions.
I think so too. It shows that even online discussions that seem all over the place can have some valuable stuff in them, if you're willing to look for it.
Okay, so speaking of looking for things, there were quite a few comments in the thread that were pretty politically charged. Some people were blaming like recent government changes for the idea that there are more crashes, talking about cuts to safety and stuff. Others were saying it's all tied to diversity and inclusion in the aviation industry.
Ah, yes. Got to bring politics into it, right? It seems like you can't have a conversation about anything these days without it turning into a political debate.
It's true, and it's frustrating when you're just trying to have a conversation based on like facts.
I hear you. I hear you. But it's important to remember that we're not here to like take sides or anything. We're just presenting the information as it is and encouraging people to think for themselves.
Exactly. So if anyone's listening and feeling a little uneasy about their next flight, just remember that statistically, flying is still one of the safest ways to travel.
It really is. And even though it's totally understandable to feel some anxiety, especially with everything that's been in the news, it's important to separate those feelings from the actual data and all the safety procedures that are in place to keep passengers safe.
So basically, don't let those feelings stop you from flying.
Yeah, I like that. And sometimes just understanding why we're feeling anxious, like because of the media or because we just naturally try to find explanations for things, can actually help us deal with those feelings better.
Okay, so what stood out to you most from this whole Reddit thread? Anything that surprised you or made you start asking your own questions?
You know what really struck me was just how many different kinds of responses there were, from jokes and blaming people to like actually analyzing the statistics. It's like a perfect example of how we as humans try to understand difficult stuff, and it shows how important it is to think critically about information, especially online. Because online, people's opinions often get more attention than the facts. And this brings me to a question for our listeners. If the media and these isolated events can affect the way we see risk so easily, what other parts of our lives might we be misjudging? What other fears or anxieties might be because of the way information is presented to us?
Ooh, that's a good one. Really makes you think.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does make you think about how we get all this information thrown at us all the time, and sometimes we don't even realize how it's shaping our view of the world.
Right. Yeah, it's like we need to learn how to spot the BS and figure out what's actually true.
That's a great way to put it. And learning to do that starts with questioning what we think we know, looking at things from different angles, and really examining the evidence.
That sounds like a lot of work, though.
It is, but it's so worth it, especially if it helps us avoid like unnecessary stress and worry.
Totally. Because when we let fear and like bad information control us, it can really lead us down the wrong path.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it sounds like what you're saying is if we could just learn to think critically and be a little skeptical, we can approach all kinds of situations better, like flying, health scares, even politics.
Exactly. Exactly. With more clarity and confidence.
I like that.
And you know what? Maybe if we all did that a little more, we could actually have better conversations with each other, even when we don't agree.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up this deep dive into plane crashes and all the stuff we talked about with risk and critical thinking, I think the main takeaway is that flying is statistically very safe.
It is.
But it's important to understand like all the nuances so we can see past the fear-mongering and make good decisions.
And I think even more importantly, it encourages us to be curious, to question things, and to be open to changing our minds.
Yeah, I love that. So thanks everyone for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Yeah, keep thinking. Absolutely. And, it's like we were saying earlier, it is a lot of work, but it's worth it because when we let fear and misinformation like take over, it can really lead us down some like pretty unproductive paths. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah. And so, like with this whole plane crash thing, we can acknowledge that, yeah, sometimes it's a little scary to think about, but we don't have to let that fear like completely control us. And the data actually shows that it's really safe.
It does. It does. And sometimes, just understanding those factors, like understanding like, okay, the media is playing this up a bit, or, maybe my brain is just like looking for someone to blame here. Sometimes just having that awareness can help us feel a little bit better.
I think that's a really good point. Like just having that awareness can actually help us deal with those feelings better.
Exactly, exactly. And, at the end of the day, we just want to encourage everyone to approach like all information with with a healthy dose of skepticism
Yeah,
and curiosity too, Don't just accept everything you hear at face value.
right. Question everything.
Exactly.
And so I think we've done a pretty good job of like breaking down this whole plane crash thing and talking about risk perception and critical thinking and all that.
I think so too.
And, the bottom line is flying is statistically very safe. But it's helpful to understand like all the different factors at play so we can see past all the hype and the fear-mongering
Absolutely.
and just make like informed decisions about everything really, not just flying.
That's so true. And, I really hope this conversation has encouraged people to not just think about flying, but to think about all kinds of information they come across in their daily lives.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.